Welcome back to Roompact's ResEdChat podcast, a platform to showcase people doing great work and talk about hot topics in residence life and college student housing. I am excited about our topic today because as I think about the different identity groups that we have living on campus, I always want to make sure that we are in tune with what that community may need, that we're providing supportive spaces, spaces where folks can learn and grow, and ultimately achieve their goals of why they came to the institution to graduate. So today we're going to be talking about how do we support students who identify as LGBT who live on our college campuses. And so with that, I'm very excited for our guest to be here today. I've known him for a very long time, had the pleasure of working with him at Miami, Ohio. He's just a wonderful professional doing some amazing work and is spending time with us today to talk to us more about how we can support those students. So I will have our guests start off by introducing themselves.
Hey, thank you so much, my friend. My name is Travis Tucker. I use him as pronouns, and I currently serve as the Assistant Dean and Director of the Carly Field Center at Princeton University. Previously, I've done work in diversity and inclusion work, but specifically working with LGBTQIA populations, overseeing LGBTQ campus centers, cultural centers, and working specifically with residence life departments within LGBTQ context. So I'm very, very happy to be here.
Thank you, Travis. So I mentioned when you mentioned your introduction, you had a couple more letters versus LGBT. So what, in 2025, right? Like what are what's the series of letters or what's the appropriate way to
Yeah. I feel like that is a great first question, right? And I think that I think that depending on the context, you're going to get a different answer, right? I think that right now, when you're looking at most kind of like spaces, I think that we're looking at things like LGBTQIA, that plus um, piece is really, really important because I think that as we move forward, we want to acknowledge the fact that there are currently at least 20 that go beyond that A, while acknowledging the fact that it's really a moving target depending on the institution. Harvard, you see that they have like BLTQ to move forward bisexual individuals. You'll see more individuals or some offices or other just spaces put the T first. So it's a complicated answer. I think that people make the decision to move the letters to really make a statement on who they want up front. But now I would say as a general, that LGBTQIA plus tends to be kind of a standard, but there's no one general answer to it.
okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So let's get right into the campus housing environment.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the most common challenges that our LGBTQIA students face in campus housing or living environments?
Yeah. So this is a, a, a a great question to start with because I think that more and more of our students, the good news is that more and more of our students are feeling comfortable to be out and are coming to campus out more than ever, right? We're seeing students that are going through the process of coming out as early within their middle school experiences, their high school experiences. And so when they are coming to our campuses, they are coming in with their trans and queer identities, much more realized than they were even when I, was an undergraduate student. And so I think that that's a really, really beautiful thing. I think that what that does mean on the other end, and particularly when we're talking about like not just like residential life, but I think within a higher education context, is like how do we move forward to meet those students' needs, right? And what are we doing to ensure that our students have the supports that they need? And so housing being one of them. And so I think that in the conversations that I've had with students, particularly around housing, um, there rarely can be a range of things where the process of what does it look like to be within gender neutral housing or sort of having housing that is specifically connected to having a neutralized space versus having maybe living learning community space or affinity space. And so depending on your institution, maybe you don't have, may not, since some institutions don't have the capacity or have like a living learning community program, that sometimes then faces the piece where you're looking at a neutral space, wanting to have that sense of community and belonging, but that gender neutral housing space sometimes isn't made for that or created for that. It truly is just a space where, kind of gender identity or like sexual orientation, all of those spaces aren't really accounted for that. And so those are things that I would have to work through with students, depending on the institution that I was working in, was really trying to understand what they wanted out of their housing experience. What were they looking for within their housing experience? And then working within the housing assignments office, whether it's with housing coordinators, whether it's like with the hall directors that within the building, whether sometimes it's with their RA, depending on the situation, to really talk through how they were making sense of the space and giving them that connection. So I would say that that's like one common piece. I would say within the larger, if there was like maybe a secondary piece, it's education. And I think that that is like, going around, particularly for our trans and non-binary students, understanding that those populations continue to grow and change. And I think because of that growth and change, and because it's happening so quickly in a positive direction, more and more people are coming out. There sometimes can be a knowledge gap depending on the campus that you're working in, with students around what those communities look like. And so then that sometimes can create misunderstandings that happen on, residential floors, and spaces. And so that education piece around how we're working, how offices like mine would work with different offices and departments like a residential life office to ensure that education around those communities was happening, whether it's through a safe zone training program, whether it's through a bulletin board program. That was always something that I was like working with and contending with. And I would also say if there was a third piece, I think security, and just making sure that students feel a sense of belonging and safety within their rooms, was something that was always something that I was always talking with folks about. So
Well, thank you for sharing that. So this
yeah,
piece of, is this space for me? Um, are folks educated enough to make sure that I'm not the educator when I'm just trying to
yeah,
live here, right? And then also I
yeah.
hear you talking about that security piece. Will this be a place where I feel like I can belong and be a part of the community and feel connected and safe? So I think that the next question I want to ask you is, thinking about housing policies and procedures, like how do those factor into supporting students of this particular community? And then where are some places where you think they can be improved?
Yeah. So I think that kind of bleeding into my initial question answer to your first question, Crystal, I think part of it is meeting our sometimes our assignments processes are not met for the time that they're happening in. And I think that particularly when we're talking about, trans, non-binary, any student, when we're talking specifically around gender identity, I think not to say that this does not happen within the context of sexual orientation. I just think when we're talking about gender identity, so gender identity around like, trans identities, non-binary identities, identities that are not connected to sexual orientation. um, I think that this becomes more and more of an issue where students are needing, because sometimes the application process doesn't really address gender identity in the way that it needs to. Sometimes because it does, sometimes because students are doing the process with their parents, and then they're not able to accurately put on the application. There's a lot of different pieces that fall into it. It then leads to a situation where students are going into a space where they either feel they don't feel a sense of security within the space, or they feel uncomfortable within the space, and then that then creates issues like within like the room, the floor, etc. So I think that like how I think from like an assignments piece, it's like how can we work to make sure that we're accounting for students of differing identities. Now some parts of that, because particularly for our first year students, if they're navigating the application process with their parents, there's so much that we can do as professionals. But on the larger end, what can we do to ensure that our students have a sense of support there? So that was always one piece I always was thinking through. I think another piece is the living learning community piece. And I recognize that for some institutions that might be listening to this, like that's not a program that they have. But I do think that like if you are not able to have a living learning community space within a floor, or if that's not where, just campus climate wise, your institution can't do that. What does it look like for you to have, a relationship with, multicultural centers, LGBTQ resource centers, whatever space, and to make sure that that relationship is strong and consistent. That the staff members that are working within that space, that you're bringing those people within to your office to work with them regularly and to get to know students. Um, I just think that that is so important, and I think unfortunately, a lot of incidents happen where because those relationships are not built, it becomes very reactionary. And the only time that offices are only ever speaking to these individuals is when a bias report has been filed, and that we never want to deal. We don't ever want that to be the initial conversation. So I really think it involves a commitment to like offices to really go out there and really have these conversations with these offices to ensure safety. If things like living, learning community spaces, affinity-based spaces aren't an option, it's like what can you do to ensure that your students feel that sense of connection to like their LGBTQ identities within housing?
I like that you talked about building a strong and consistent relationship because if I only know a resource as the office you go when there's a bias incident, I don't know about the other things that are being offered, right? What are the programmatic opportunities? Or like,
Yeah.
"Hey, this person is really cool, and this is an opportunity to find out who you are as a human, and let's grab coffee." And so I think that
Hmm.
relationship building piece is important, and it helps us sell that resource to the students as well if we have some
Agree.
familiarity. And then that assignments piece was huge that you mentioned because I have seen that in my time. And so I want to talk a little bit more about assignments if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, with assignments, how do you think housing staff can balance privacy and community when supporting students who are trans and non-binary in housing
Yeah.
assignments?
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of methods, and I think that the one thing as I think about this answer is that this is a new way to explore, right? Like this is a very an exciting thing that we're exploring, but it's also very new. And that because I think that again, historically, we have not um, correctly given folk trans and non-binary individuals the opportunities that they're having. So I think that there's a lot more work to be done. I do think that I've seen instances or institutions where, on the housing application, you can have like a checkbox of like different like inclusive housing, affinity-based housing. And then once that checkbox is clicked, then it opens up a separate application where if you are clicking on like this particular housing situation, it then is providing you more information around LGBTQI affinity housing. This is what it is, this is what it's not. Gender inclusive housing spaces, this is what it is, this is what it's not, and making sure that students have like a full understanding of what it is. And I always like I appreciate that piece because it's really important to make sure that students know that when they enter in those spaces, and we're not even, let's just like pull out the fact that we're having a conversation around LGBTQ folks, but individuals that aren't in the community can certainly be in gender inclusive housing spaces. But I think it's important for students when they do click on those boxes that they know what they're signing up for, that they have a full understanding that this is a safety and a security space, particularly for some students, and that's what the expectation is. And so, if this is not going to be a situation where you feel comfortable being in that space, maybe you should look into some other options and to consider like what you need as a person. So I think that information I think is really important. I've seen some instances where I think this was at one institution I was at. It's been a little bit. I'm like, did I do that? I did do this. So I actually played a part in that as like I was an LGBTQ coordinator at the time. Um, and we were running and we were creating an LGBTQIA affinity floor. So we had a full floor, about 25 to 30 residents that lived on a floor. And this was the LGBTQI floor for that campus community. And so I, gave full approval to this, but I gave my name and information as the LGBTQ campus coordinator, and worked with housing assignments to like create space around like the individuals and just having conversations. And because for some of our assignments coordinators, they felt uncomfortable about some of the questions that were being asked around just like gender identity and safety. And so I was always more than happy to do that. And so my name was part of the assignments. I would work with the assignments coordinator to kind of make sure that folks felt comfortable, gave the okay for them to like be on the floor, and that floor became part of the one of the strongest living learning communities that that campus had. So I think that it depends on the context of your building. I would just like say for assignments folks like not being afraid to ask questions. The best assignments coordinators that I've worked with have sometimes been the ones that acknowledge that I don't know what this means or I don't know what to do, and like this is just like this is I need help.
Mhm.
And just getting that help and not like expecting to know everything, because we certainly don't know everything. And so getting that I think has been super helpful. And I honestly, some of the best partnerships that I had, particularly and I worked with, was with assignments, because that piece was always so important to ensuring a student experience, particularly in the first year. After the second, as students move on, it becomes a little bit easier, especially if your living learning community was like an upperclassman one. But in that first year, when a student is coming in, it was always so crucial was to have those conversations with them to ensure, like, if a student is saying this in the application, this is what they mean, this is what they don't mean. And so I worked really well with the folks there.
And you just highlighted a really cool partnership and the maybe the necessity, right? To,
Mhm.
work with the experts, if you will, the humans from that office or that resource who can help make sure that you're providing an application process and assignment process that really honors the humans that will be living in your community. So I love that, Travis. So, we're talking about explicitly, like this grouping, right? This identity, but I imagine people are more than one thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so my question for you is like, how can housing folks ensure that we're considering the diverse experiences of folks who are LGBTQIA, and then really thinking about the intersections of the multiple identities they have?
Yes, I love this question. And I think that it's one of those pieces that within my work, so currently I work in a, for all intents and purposes, a multicultural center. And we have a sibling office that does LGBTQIA work. And so I think that that piece around like really honoring the full person becomes like a full part of what we do. And so I think that another great partnership in considering like this question, one, some of the student groups and the larger student group communities, and like how are you engaging with them and making sure that particularly for our queer and trans students, they have an understanding of like what can be involved and how they can be activated within different spaces. But I also think that particularly if you do have affinity spaces on your campus and your experience, I think there's always a balance, and that was something that we always navigated on the floor, is that we certainly want to make sure that it's a safe space and that it is as queer or trans as people want it to be, but we also always acknowledge that that is not everything that you are. And so there was very intentional conversations where we would talk within the first 2 to 3 weeks about like, how do you want to engage outside of the space? How do you want to get involved in organizations? Eventually, once you get some leadership under your belt, like an NRHH, or become like an RA, or get involved in like your RHA, and like that be just as important as a leadership experience as the time that you're in, as a LGBTQA student. But then I would also say that like, encouraging students to not be, particularly students that just come out. I think that we experience students that when they are just like coming into a space, they are just like really excited to be queer or really excited to be trans. And we love that. But we also want to make sure that people are engaging with all parts of themselves. So whether that is, them being their race, their ethnicity, national origin, any piece of the puzzle that's along with that. I think that as professionals it's like, yes, like keep going, keep diving into who you are within your queer and trans space, but what does it look like for you to get involved, like within housing spaces, within leadership spaces across campus, your academic programs, is ultimately those are all the things that are going to make you stronger. But I really appreciate the question because it really speaks to the whole thought that we're not one thing. None of us are one thing. And so I think for our students, particularly our queer student leaders, I've experienced that where people just think they're just gay. And that's, like that's not it, right? We are all more than just one thing. So it's very, very important.
And so what I'm hearing, even if you do have those affinity spaces or, living learning spaces that is devoted to this community, as housing professionals, we shouldn't hyper focus in on this one identity and treat students as if that's all they are.
Yeah.
Then we're not honoring them, because hey, they're also a student, right? They may be a sibling, they may be so in addition to the isms that exist, right? Like there's all these really cool pieces, and it's an opportunity for us to be let in that way. So let's talk training, because you talked about
Yeah.
education earlier, right? And I think that's really important. So, what are some training and development opportunities that should be provided or need to
Yeah.
be provided for our housing staff to make sure that they're being supportive and understanding of this identity community?
Yes. So I've had the pleasure of doing a number of trainings, both for professional staff and student staff over the years, and I around queer, excuse me, queer and trans identities. And I think there are things that are basics, quote unquote, and then I think that it really is then the piece where you are like working with a professional to really be honest around like the gaps of that you're seeing with your staff, and working to address those. So the basics, pronouns, and understanding like the how to use pronouns, how when you mispronounce somebody, how to address that and readdress that, particularly when you're building out community guidelines at the beginning of the year, or if you do it semesterly, how is that like looking when you're talking about gender identity and inclusion within like a space, and like doing that in those conversations. um I think that's like really important. And then from a professional staff side, like how are you training individuals on your teams? Like when a larger issue around either mispronouncing or dead naming individuals are like happening within spaces, how are you redirecting students to like the resources so they don't feel as if they have to be like the one person that is solving this big issue for their building? So all of that piece where we're like naming the issue, directing the issue, and then also just providing guidance around it. I think also like larger pieces just around the community. So explaining the acronym, providing context on like why the history of the acronym and why it is, why we use the plus. How we acknowledge, that there are more identities that are outside of the spaces. I think for some campuses, and this is always campus dependent, but inclusive restrooms is an important piece. Do you know where your inclusive restroom map is? Do you know how to access it? Is it accessible on your like a cell phone? And for your student staff and for your professional staff, can you walk a student through, wanting to make sure that they have that piece there? So I think that there are some like very kind of like basic level things, 101 type of things that you want to touch base on. So the history of the community, why it's important to be in this training today, understanding the importance of like what, particularly for our trans and non-binary students, their experiences, understanding the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. They're two separate things. That's very important as well. And then it kind of can get parsed through where if you are experiencing issues, specific issues, if you are noticing that your RAs over time are really struggling with this particular issue within the community, if your professional staff is like really struggling with a specific issue within the community, um, I won't go into full detail, but there was an experience of an interpersonal violence instance that happened on a campus that I was working in, and that experience really traumatized a lot of individuals. LGBTQIA communities tend to be much smaller in comparison to their straight counterparts, and so when one person is a survivor of interpersonal violence, it really triggers a whole lot of discord. This happened in a residence life space. Um, and so I really worked particularly with the group to really talk through like what a training could look like to one provide education post experience, but then also to acknowledge just acknowledge what happened. And so I think that that's the piece where I actually I always loved doing what's a pronoun and here's this and I always appreciate and I value those trainings, but I really appreciate the second those secondary trainings because it really is a housing staff being honest with themselves and saying this is a problem. Our students are saying that this is a problem and we really need to address it. And I always like really appreciated the humbleness that came from staff leaders and saying, where there's this gap in our office and our students and we can't have this gap, so let's like fix it and address it and um, go from there.
And thank you. You made it sound really easy for a housing team to reach out to or connect with a campus partner and be vulnerable and answer those questions. Now, that might be different depending on the institution
Yeah.
and the staff, but it sounds like being willing to name what you know and what you don't know, and that you need some help and support. And going out to that campus partner, is something that would be welcomed. I've had instances where folks might say, I'm not a member of XYZ community, right? Or I don't look like this group. And so I can't help them, or I'm stuck. What do I do? And so I think that that even can be a question if folks feel comfortable. And also, Google is a thing. But it sounds like, that could even be invited of a private conversation with maybe a team member and say, hey, how can I be helpful? How can I educate myself so I am able to help folks, even if I'm not a member of that community? And also having
Yeah.
sensitivity as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah, Crystal, I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with staff and student staff, that same thing where it is like, and when it's a professional staff member, it's like I have a colleague of mine um that is transitioning, that just came out. I've not and like, maybe had a close relationship with this individual and they just didn't know like how to interact or have conversation with them. And I would just say that particularly for folks that are listening to this, um I think that it's it takes a lot to acknowledge you don't know something, right? Like particularly on higher education spaces where we are like the knowledge we are supposed to be like knowledge knowers at it feels like at all times sometimes. To really take the grace to just go to somebody that does have some knowledge around some of these things and sit down. And some of these people I really didn't know. They just knew that LGBTQIA was in my title, and they maybe had seen me in one training, and that was it. So it's not as if I had like a very close relationship with some of these folks. Some folks I did, but I do think that and I can't speak for all of my equity and inclusion professional colleagues, but I would much, at least speaking for myself, I would much rather you have the conversation with me than go out and cause harm within our community space. So if you are leaning towards one way or the other, please have the courage to have the conversation, because you are saving a lot of potential pain for someone else within a space.
That was really deep. Like, to have the courage to have the conversation. I really appreciate that. And you talked really, you talked about how we can collaborate with campus partners to support students. And so I think I want to get into what are some of the like inspiring stories or success stories that you've witnessed in creating inclusive housing spaces for our LGBTIQ students. I just made
Yeah.
up another. IA students. I was like IQ. Like what am I talking about?
Look, they are smart. No. No, so yeah, like I've been so lucky to have worked with such like talented students. I mean, I watched one particularly, the first thing that came to mind when you asked that question was watching. So I previously worked at, before I was at Princeton, my last stop was at Washington University in St. Louis. And I had a dual role where I was the associate director of kind of a multicultural center office, and then also was directing kind of this LGBTQ piece. So it was two in one. So one of the jobs, one of the students that I was working with, and my coordinator at the time was working with, um, she had this really vision of like, I want to build an LGBTQI LLC. I want to do it. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it. And we luckily, are on that campus, living learning communities. WashU has like a residential college system, but living learning communities was, and I believe still is, an option for upperclassmen students. Um, and so this student worked directly with, residence life staff, to put in an application and develop this community, this like safe space, for our students. And by the time that I left, it was the most popular one was there. It was the one that particularly for our queer and trans students, was always full. For some living and learning communities, I know folks that might be listening to this, for LLC folks, you're like, doesn't always happen because numbers can sometimes don't always fill, but that one always filled. And it really, I really, that purely came from students. That purely came from a student wanting a safe space to live, and knowing that her friends wanted a safe space to live, and she built it. So I just thought that that was just so impressive. Outside of that, I mean, I would say that there's been so many great programs and programmatic experiences that I've seen, throughout living learning communities. I've seen so many, really thoughtful. I've had so many awesome RAs. Now that I'm thinking about it, in the past, that were, allies to the community, but they were just like, I really want to do something for my students, to feel like a sense of safety and security. And so since most schools are out by June, um, you know, LGBTQ History Month in October, really, for one of my RAs, former RAs in particular. I used to be a hall director, as a by the way, I would like realize I didn't mention that. But one of my RAs, was like, I want to do like a Pride Month thing for like our students. And so we took the time to build that out, took the time to build out the programming, brought in the coordinator for the LGBTQ Resource Center, at the time, that was on our campus, and really developed that space. And so many of the students that were on that floor, had left with so much more knowledge around like communities and understanding of communities, simply because that RA, who was just an ally and had friends that were, within the community, said, I actually really want to do this. And I really appreciate that, because it really speaks to, it doesn't have to be, somebody in the community. It can be anybody. It's just, you have to take a stand and say, I want to do this. It can be as easy as like an event or events, or I mean, it obviously can be as structural as like building out like a whole floor. But I think that for students, I think our goal as professionals, is empowering them. Like, how do we empower students to make sure that they have agency in their own experience, so that they can feel as if they can build out whatever they need to build out? And so, as a supervisor, and as a an advisor, eventually, that was always my big goal, was how do we create the space so that students feel comfortable, because students are they're just so much smarter than we sometimes give them credit. And if they can sense that that space isn't, being developed from an exterior, they're not going to dream. And then that's sometimes where a lot of those great ideas don't ever come to fruition, that can really change a housing space.
And students, like, they know, right, what they need, and,
Yeah.
how do we and sometimes I think we just make decisions without the stakeholders or some of the key stakeholders at the table. And so I think this is a
Hmm.
really neat example of a student naming something and then you're like, let's do this, right? How can I support
Hmm.
you? So I love that example. So I want to ask you, what are some emerging trends that housing professionals should be aware of? I know there's some legislature pieces that are happening, right? Like there's just stuff um,
Yeah.
that, just, news feed, turn on the radio or whatever you get your news media, like there's stuff to be aware of. But like in your, your work and trying to make sure that you're continuously supporting students in this community, like what should we know as housing professionals?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say, you mentioned legislation, but one thing I mean, I look at legislation every time I can, frankly. That particularly if you're working at a state institution, your state legislation and your federal, I mean, federal, yes, but your state legislation is going to dictate a lot of like what you can do, unfortunately, sometimes for like the housing space. And so I think being mindful of that is um, something that is deeply important. Mainly thinking about our state and public institutions, but also acknowledging that it's truly all of us. I would say outside of that, trends to be mindful of, and I think that we've, talked a little bit, about it, so far. But mainly for our trans and non-binary students, the numbers of students that are identifying in that way continue to grow. When we're looking statistically at who is coming out, I always say that it's less about the LGB, and it's more about the T, and the NB. And so that might eventually, who knows, like lead to a realignment of letters that we're currently seeing. But statistically, we are seeing more and more of students where gender identity is a huge part of how they are like coming out. And so I think that as housing professionals, that need and desire to making sure that our students have a safe and secure space where is going to be really important. So talking about like not just so we talked about like the housing application and the assignments process, but even when students get into the space, what does it look like? And how are you developing that sense of security and safety for our students as they're entering? So that I would say is going, for the few several years and even longer. Just thinking about the numbers of the community, that is going to continue to be a thing. So I would encourage housing professionals, if they have not started doing their research around just like trans and non-binary, like security and safe and sense of security and meaning. I know that there's folks like Z Nicolazzo, and that Z is doing some really great work. Miami alum, doing really, really great work on that and has some really great resources there. So I would encourage them to look through that. Um, I would also say that another piece, and maybe this is one that maybe doesn't get as talked about as much, but I think that I am like seeing this more and more, is really addressing like how, and we've touched a little bit about this, but ensuring that our LGBTQIA students feel that sense of connection to larger campus. And that is like becoming much, I think that from a trend wise, when we're looking at students, the statistics around sense of security and sense of belonging on a campus. Statistically, a lot of our trans and non-binary students tend to be the ones that are falling a little bit lower. You could say that, we could extrapolate that to maybe students of color and, but for this conversation, um, those statistic pieces tends to be a little bit lower for a lot of different institutions. I'm sure for some that might be different. So what does that mean when a lot of those students, depending on the institution that you are at, are if there's it's a housing institution or a residential based college, they're at home. So what does that mean for your space if that is a consistent need? How are you addressing that in the partnerships that in relationships that you're building with coordinators of LGBTQ resource centers, directors of LGBTQ resource centers? What are the big events that you can do, but also the small ones, those incremental changes? Or how are you benchmarking that success within the data of like are you seeing substantial growth and the progress that you're doing when you're putting on these new programs and initiatives, and so maybe you can get more money for those things as they hopefully pop up. um, And I would just say if there's like a last like big trend that I'm noticing, particularly that we as professionals need to work on to get better on, um, is like the larger advocating for our students. I as a former staff member of one of an LGBTQ resource center, more than once, I deeply have valued and appreciated being the an advocate for our students. But I think that a lot of times, folks that are the one for their campus, and for a lot of LGBTQ professionals, you usually are the one, they need backup, and they need folks that really know our students within the residence halls, residence colleges, whatever your system is, to really help them, and to really understand like what the what is going on with that student. So it's a student to student piece. So if you have that relationship with students, I think that really understanding what community looks like for them, understand if you have that relationship, strong enough relationship, understanding their identities and maybe doing that work on your own, to understand those identities. But we don't want things to happen, but inevitably they do. What does it look like for you to be a partner to an LGBTQ resource center office, so that the person that is in that office and is working with five other students experiencing the same thing across campus, maybe can you can be the primary to their secondary in that situation. You can be the person that is like helping to support that individual and doing that part too. And I think that that involves just education and involves building relationships with the LGBTQ folks within the office. And it's just also it puts the onus back on you, to have like that time. But ultimately I think it makes you a better professional, because down the line you will have other students that will identify in that way, and then they will see you as a support, because that's what happens. If you do, if you do a good job with one student, particularly within the community, three other students will come down, and you will be seen as a safe space, which for LGBTQ folks, that's a big deal. So, yeah, I would encourage all those things.
What a reminder of the importance of our living roles is building community and making connections with the students, because there's just a different experience that you get when you're with them.
Yeah.
And you live with them. And obviously there's balance and boundaries and different pieces you need to be mindful of, right? But I think that like being in the community and the importance of that. So I do want to ask you, we're coming to the end of our time. If folks wanted to learn more about this topic, where do you think they should start? Are there resources that you would recommend? I know you mentioned Z Nicolazzo's work, which is amazing. Other resources you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, I mean, I would look towards the consortium of higher education. So the consortium is a group of LGBTQA professionals, so LGBTQA center directors, assistant directors, coordinators, program coordinators. And these are all individuals that more sometimes are on your campus, so you probably know them, but it's a group of other individuals across the country, and they have a lot of like great resources and tools, to really think through, what it looks like to understand the experience of, an LGBTQA person on a college campus. The Campus Pride Index, I mean, I would encourage people to look at that if they have not yet. So that index is a 5-star index. I always recognize with folks that there is, always a feel about Campus Pride just based on like the judging process and how it looks. But I think it's a really, really good resource because one, there is a specific place, for housing, and that is part of the score. Is that they're asking individual schools to meet a need around affinity-based housing, inclusive-based housing, and so you can, if you haven't, you can look up, where your school ranks. And then you can also see where, if your institution does have gaps, what are those gaps? And then it can really hopefully start a conversation about how we're filling those, how if we're doing well in a certain thing, how can we continue that or how can we amplify it? I think that that is always really important. And then also, I would always just like lean into like the professional organizations, other professional organizations. So ACPA has some really great resources. NASPA, the Gender and Sexuality Knowledge Community, also has some like really good white papers, on just like understanding gender and sexuality as a whole. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would definitely just encourage individuals to just keep educating themselves. I always say this, I have been doing, LGBTQI specific work, for almost 10 years now. And I am still researching. I'm still trying to understand. You don't ever stop. And so I think that that's a responsibility that we have to our students. Um, that when a student comes in with an identity that you have not heard of, because that's happened to me in LGBT role, to do the work on it and research what that is so that you can continue to have a better relationship with that student.
Travis, this was a really good conversation, and I'm thinking of the like a really good adjective because there's so many questions that you pose that I want to write down for myself and do my own research on my own campus and really think about how I can differently and better support students and then model that for the staff that are in my portfolio. And so thank you, Travis, for joining us today. This was amazing.
Thank you, Crystal. I really appreciate it. Thank
And
you. Thank you.
thanks. Yes, thank you so much. And thanks for all of you for joining us on this episode of Res Ed Chat. If you have an idea of a topic or a person you'd like us to have on the show, please let us know by reaching out to Roompact. Take care.